2, 1. We are recording with Mr. David Vine, author of Base Nation. And when I have on authors that I like, I fanboy, and I've stopped trying to suppress that part of me, so I'm just going to let it out. I hope that my listeners don't, I hope that I haven't sort of forced a tolerance on them to my hyperbole, because I always have on authors. And in the last week, I've said 2 times in the last week, I've said this is one of my new favorite books, top 10 all time. And I don't want them to start thinking that I'm just saying that about everyone. Oh, it's the best book ever. But the stars actually have aligned. And with Mr. Jefferson Morley, with Mr. Will Arkin, and now with Mr. David Vine, these are actually 3 books in my top 10 favorite books. So this podcast has been going since December 12th, 2019. We are on episode 428. It truly is. This is in my new top 10 favorite books. I don't want to hammer that into them and think it's not sincere anymore, but it really is. I've listened to it. Actually, I'm on my 5th listen through right now. I legitimately love it. It's called Base Nation. It's about America's bases abroad, which I didn't know about until I saw a YouTube video like a month and a half ago. And it was this guy talking about, he's like, has anyone ever thought about bases abroad? And I was like, no, I guess I haven't. And I believe you were on there, and I saw your book, and I was like, well, what is this? And I got your book, and it's just been a rabbit hole since then. But now that I got my fanboy out, please introduce yourself.
Tommy, thank you so much. That's incredibly kind. I mean, I think we all should have, top 10 lists that have 100, 100 items, 100 books, 100 films on them. So wherever I fall, thank you for all those kind words.
Absolutely.
So I'm a writer. I've written 3 books, and I'm a professor at American University in Washington, D.C., as you know, and I'm just thrilled to get a chance to talk about Base Nation and get a chance to meet you. So thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Also, first episode with the soundproofing, so hopefully that makes it sound a little bit. I don't have the flag up right now because I got it through all. But point is so I had never thought about, I mean, it is kind of, I've never left the United States, whereas my older brother has visited a ton of different countries, and I can already, he and I, you could, it's like a control setting, right? I mean, obviously grew up in the same family, same schooling, same everything. And I can see how much, and I hate to admit it, I can see how much more tolerant he is and how open his mind is compared to my American-centric viewpoint. And kind of using that as like an analogy is, I had never thought about it. You just grow up, you don't know something, I don't think about speaking English. This is how I talk. And it wasn't until I saw that video that I was like, well, yeah, I guess we do have bases all around the world. And, again, just, you also got that Uncle Sam propaganda. Well, we're the world police. We're the good guys. But you start thinking, you're like, well, that would be, what if Germany said, hey, we're going to put a military base just outside Boston? You proposed that, well, with a different country in Miami. You proposed that, and I remember saying out loud, like, the hell you are. And it's wow. And it's, you pointed out, we have more military bases in more foreign nations than any other empire in American, or in not American history, in world history. And it seems to just be perpetuating. Do you see it ever retracting, or are we in this new era, I mean, new relatively to human history, of just a worldwide network of power projection?
I do see change as not just possible, but coming. Indeed, so the United States has now around 800 military bases outside the 50 states and Washington, D.C., in some 83 countries. And I say around, and about 83 countries, around 800 bases in about 83 countries, because we don't know exactly how many bases there are abroad. The Pentagon doesn't even know, the military doesn't even know exactly how many bases they have abroad. The Pentagon had been putting together a list on an annual basis until the Trump administration stopped fulfilling its congressional mandates in a whole variety of ways, including this annual list. But my calculation of around 800 bases in about 80 countries and territories colonies outside the 50 states comes from the Pentagon's list, and then adds bases that are well documented and frequently well known, as well as some secretive bases where there is some documentation. But the actual total might even be higher. It's important to point out that there have been times in recent US history, at the height of the US wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, when there were more than 2,000 US bases abroad. So we have seen just in the past few years some reduction. And of course, the Biden administration has said that it will withdraw bases and troops from Afghanistan by the 9/11 anniversary. Previous presidents as well, George W. Bush, George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, also closed very large number of bases abroad, mostly in Europe, some in Asia. And the Biden administration, I'm encouraged to point out, has launched what it's calling a global posture review. So they're reviewing the infrastructure of bases and the deployment of troops. There are hundreds of thousands of US troops in addition to these bases. They're not just sitting empty, of course. The Biden administration is reviewing this system of bases and troops deployed around the world, with the understanding that US troops and bases may not be deployed in a very effective way. And that's the conclusion that many people are coming to across the political spectrum, and people in the US military are coming to the same conclusion. The highest ranking general, in the highest ranking military officer in the US military, the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said that we have too much infrastructure abroad, that we have to look at the need for every single base overseas. So I think we're at a moment where we're going to see some significant closures abroad that I've been calling for, and many people have been calling for years.
Yeah, I had on the other day, I had on Will Arkin in his book, "The Generals Have No Clothes." And it's kind of a different examination. Yours is the infrastructure and the cultural impacts and the economics around it. His is more about the kind of it's like a new take on Eisenhower's the military industrial complex. But he points out towards the end of his book, what coronavirus showed was that we could greatly skim down on things, and the missions, the critical missions, were still carried out. And for everyone listening, your book isn't this scathing America bad military evil, because that's easy to write. Anybody can write that. Yours is a look at, I mean, really, a lot of the corruption and the self-licking ice cream cone. Why do we have the private chefs? Well, the chefs gotta, they gotta cook for the contractors. What are the contractors there for? Well, we can't have the chefs dying. Well, what are the chefs doing? Well, they gotta cook for the contractors. And it's like, what are we even doing? Why are we even why are we going around this circle? At some point, does anyone stop? Now, there are obviously, um, you know, I am biased as someone that loves the United States. But I mean, there are, as Mike Baker said, the former CIA guy who's been on Joe Rogan, says, look, America's bad. Like, we've done a lot of bad things. To say we haven't is simply untrue. In his words, however, someone is going to wield the biggest stick in the world. I would rather it be us than, say, China or Russia, which could be debated to the end of time. Free shipping lanes, But there is something that comes up more and more as people talk about, is the US dollar not going to be the reserve currency anymore? Are we going to see hyperinflation? Are we going to see a realignment of the world's powers from a unipolar to a bipolar or tripolar? But what we've never seen before is the sort of late stage empire that a lot of people say the United States is in, which again can be debated to the end of time. There's never been a late stage empire with the military as large as ours is. And there's been big ones. There's been big ones that are spread thin, Genghis Khan, Roman Empire, sure. But there's never been one with what you point out towards the end of your book is by having these little bases all around, from the big ones, the Ramsteins, to the lily pads, to the tiny little ones that no one really knows about. And don't look over there, that's classified. We have this, and not only that, these stockpiles of chemical weapons, of artillery shells, of ammo, of everything all around the world. We've taken what normally is what you would use in a war zone, maybe Normandy, and you set up your supply lines 3 deep or whatever. But we're now doing that around the world. And it seems like we've got this vice grip on the world now. That's gonna who gives that up? Whoever in power, whoever gives up their power, whoever, what politician ever, votes for, like, salary decreases for themselves, right? You point out very clear, and I know I'm rambling, but you point out very clearly and well documented, we've got this sort of serpentine grip on the world. And when we close things down in Europe, what we're really doing is we're pivoting to Africa, where it seems like the next half century of wars might be. Rare earth metals, all the minerals, new oil supplies. We have China in there with their Belt and Road Initiative. I feel, how do you expect the people in power to give up that power? Do you see, does that am I making sense? Does that seem like a reasonable argument? As you point out, we're seeming to have a grip on the globe itself. Sorry, I get excited.
Yeah, no, this is fantastic. No, I guess I think the power that policymakers, that politicians, that presidents, that high-ranking military officials think they have is actually, I think, a whole lot more hollow than they imagine.
Okay.
And I think the generals have no
Yeah.
clothes is sort of captures that, and COVID does as well. These bases have not protected us. This permanent infrastructure of military force deployed around the world, has not been serving the interests of most U.S. Americans. It has been serving the interests of some. It's been serving the interests of military contractors that have made tens of billions of dollars in some cases, building and maintaining and expanding these bases. It's benefited the careers of some military officers who, are the commanders on these bases. And there is a very serious bureaucratic and political problem, indeed, as you're pointing to, that it is difficult for leaders to give up a perceived source of power. But I think the more people, again, across the political spectrum are seeing that this power is indeed hollow, and is not serving to protect the United States, is not serving to protect US citizens, but instead in many ways is distracting the US military, is weakening the US military, is distracting the military from actually protecting the borders of the United States, which are very safe to begin with, and of course are siphoning off literally tens of billions of dollars a year that could be better spent elsewhere. For some, that's better spent in other parts of the military. For others, myself included, we should be diverting funds spent on maintaining this huge infrastructure of bases abroad to maintaining, for example, our infrastructure at home
Yeah.
that is crumbling in so many ways. Our roads, our public transportation, our public schools, where, in my mind, every day that a student in our country receives a substandard education at a public school, which is every single day in so many communities around the country, that child is being damaged.
Mhm.
And every day we're spending $1 to maintain an unnecessary base abroad, that when we could be spending that dollar back home, we are contributing to that harm that child is experiencing at that school. And the same goes with our healthcare system, with our pandemic preparedness, with our public health infrastructure, all of which have been truly hollowed out because we've been maintaining this huge infrastructure of bases abroad that, just to point out, is costing us around, this was 2017, $51 billion a year. So the actual total now is probably creeping up on $60 billion a year. This is just to maintain bases abroad, not troops, just the infrastructure. And that's the size of the State Department's budget. This should trouble all of us.
It's, well, and I mean, and for me, what I always point to is, everyone's heard me on this podcast talk about my brother, mental health care. I mean, we
Thank
can't
you.
put money towards that. I mean, and let alone, this doesn't even need to be a bleeding heart. You could focus this on military. 22 veterans a day commit suicide. I mean, this is a huge thing. Mental health care close, well, granted it was under Reagan, but close, not to go off into the weeds, but closing all the mental health care facilities with all the patients in them. And not only that, is it's not, let's just play devil's advocate. You could swing around and say, it's a zero sum world. It is a vicious world. You do need military projection. And I do fully believe that. However, this isn't this isn't calling for shutting it all down. There's a lot of excessive stuff that it isn't, it is a lot of guys just pocketing money. It is a lot of chefs cooking for contractors, protecting the chefs. I'm not saying
Yes.
shut down Ramstein or shut down Okinawa. It's just, do we need 19 lily pads in Nigeria?
But yes, you're asking all the right important questions. Although I guess I wonder, do we need what do we need power projection for?
I would say in full disclosure, as a biology major and not a military veteran, so in my armchair general, I would say, just looking at the history of man, I think you definitely need enough to protect yourself. Just like I think the most stabilizing thing about the Cold War was probably in 1949 when the Soviets detonated their first A bomb. That was a stabilizing power. Up until then, I don't know if you know, and not a lot of people know, Annie Jacobson talks about it in her book DARPA, The Pentagon's Brain. In 1947 to 48, there was actually public discussion about us preemptively nuking the Soviets from coast to coast to get rid of any, kind of smothering our enemy in the cradle while they're still a baby. We didn't think that they were going to detonate an A bomb until, I think, the CIA said it wasn't until they didn't think the Soviets could do it until 1955. But then General James McCormick of the Atomic Energy Commission went to tell David Lilienthal of the Atomic Energy Commission that in 1949 a sniffer plane had picked up radioactive cloud off the coast of the Soviet Union, and that Valenti Beryov, now I'm kind of just quoting a book, they detonated a lot sooner. That was the most equalizing thing, because all of a sudden we couldn't bully them. And I look at nuclear weapons as the ultimate kind of level playing field. That being said, I think that and I've had a friend on here argue, and I think argue well, that a strong China and a strong Russia might actually be the most peaceful thing. I think we need power projection in the sense that I think it was good when the Soviets developed an A bomb. I hope no one takes that clip out of context, but that is what I mean. And again, my humble opinion as a biology major.
So just going with that argument,
Sure.
though, given that the United States, I don't know how many nuclear warheads do we have now, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000, I believe,
Yeah.
and Russia has fewer than it did when in the days of the Soviet Union, and China has a few hundred. Why do we need bases?
Very true. Very true. No, it's like what Eisenhower said. Every general will always use every weapon they have before they surrender or have their men killed or have their homeland invaded. So why, or it's like there was an Onion article from like 2005, and it was, World War III will be interesting because there will be several hours of extraordinary conventional weapons before we move to thermonuclear. And I think that's a brilliant question that I don't have the answer to. Why do we need any of that? It's like, yeah, why? Just let it escalate. No one's going to go all the way.
Well, my fear, of course, with nuclear weapons available is that eventually they will be used, and I'm very afraid that in my lifetime, our lifetimes, the lifetime of most people listening or watching, that nuclear weapons could be used, will be used, unless we abolish them. So, my call is very much not one for close all the bases and maintain the nukes. I think the abolition of nuclear weapons has to be an urgent priority for many of the same reasons, including the financial ones, the huge sums of money that are being spent on nuclear weapons that are just sitting there and that can, destroy the world many times over. Speaking of, overkill, literally and figuratively. But of course, the danger that they possess, just an accidental detonation would be devastating, to say the least. And the fact that there are people in the U.S. military, there are people in the sort of foreign policy blob, as it's frequently referred to, the sort of mainstream foreign policy pundits and think tank types in Washington, D.C., the fact that so many of them now are not just contemplating a war between the United States and China, but see it as inevitable, should truly frighten all of us, because I don't know what they're imagining, that a war between these two nuclear armed powers, between the two wealthiest countries on Earth, the two largest militaries, most powerful militaries on earth, that wouldn't become a nuclear conflict and wouldn't cause catastrophic damage is beyond me. It's really frightening. And in addition to abolishing nuclear weapons, I think preventing a war between the United States and China has to be at the very top of a list of foreign policy priorities. And changing this kind of assumption that a war between the United States and it what times feels like a kind of intellectual curiosity and almost sports-like enthusiasm among some
Yeah.
of these military folks and think tank types who want to see a war between the United States and China. That should be frightening to all of us, especially following the last 20 years of catastrophic wars that the United States has been waging. And that's part of why I asked the question about projection for what. Bases abroad have made it just far too easy to go to war, far too easy to launch offensive interventionist wars of choice, wars that have been not just catastrophic in Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Libya, Yemen, and on, but catastrophic for the United States, for the veterans who have come back, in many cases dead, in other cases grievously wounded, either physically or mentally or both. And again, the money that has been spent, taxpayer money, upwards of $6.4 trillion, 6.4 trillion with a T dollars has been spent or obligated by Congress from taxpayer funds on the 5 most violent wars since 9/11. Again, imagine what we could have done with $6.4 trillion. It should really,
It
sadden, to say the least, sadden all of us.
it's I was gonna say, yeah, and to touch on the nuclear weapons, yeah, I mean, no one really thinks about it, but I mean, who is one of the most vocal guys about it but, the Ronald Reagan himself. Despite the military buildup, his whole thing going to Reykjavik was about abolish nuclear weapons. There is precedent for this. And then, I mean, not only all the accidents, I mean, there's 5 or 6 like very, I guess, what am I looking for? Scary ones over the just lack of terms, scary ones over the Cold War. But I mean, we also have guys like General MacArthur, who was chomping at the bit to drop him in Korea, and Truman had to let him go. We have Patton. Patton was, we gotta fight the Soviets. General LeMay, he called it a Sunday punch. His top guys used to call it, quote, killing a nation. They had these plans to go in and just drop 3,000 bombs in an afternoon. And I mean, he used to have like B-47 Hustlers, I think. He'd have them sprint to the Soviet Union border and then pull away. And someone in Kennedy's cabinet said, if you keep doing that, you're going to cause World War III. And LeMay said, if we were so lucky.
Which, yeah, is
It's
is
insane.
unbelievable. It's insane, yeah. And
Insanity.
and I think it's a symptom. A lot of my work is focused on studying policymakers and members of the military. And I think when you see leaders like that, it speaks to the distance. I mean, there are many ways to analyze it, including perhaps from a psychological dimension and literal insanity. But I'm not an expert on any of the LeMay or anyone.
Dr. Strangelove, yeah.
But I think it speaks to the distance that develops between at least some generals and admirals and the highest ranking military officials from the effects of war. I mean, I think it happens to civilian military leaders as well, civilians in the Pentagon who have never, in some cases, even been to war.
Mhm.
But they develop this distance from the human damage that war inflicts. And that's why in my book, Based Nation, and in my more recent book, The United States of War, I try to, rather than just telling or writing about the history of wars, about US bases from an abstract sort of policy perspective, I always want to put the focus on, okay, what are these bases doing?
Yeah.
What effects are they having on human beings, both those that are obvious and those that are less well known and harder to see. The fact that the human impacts of war aren't at the center of any consideration of war is something that must change.
It's yeah, it's I think about Eisenhower and his less well-known speech was that, for every fighter jet, for every new destroyer, he's like, a child is robbed of education. He's like a heavy bomber could build 5,000 homes in an American town. A new cruiser could build, that's 40 public schools in 40 American cities. He has a great speech on it, and he goes, and this isn't tree hugging Eisenhower. This is Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, 5-star general, on to become the president, up there with Ulysses S. Grant and George Washington, and that sort of pantheon of. I mean, this is a guy that said in his journal, I believe, during Korea, he wrote, "We will be burying more men this Veterans Day. Men are stupid," and that's Eisenhower. I mean, the guy who loved soldiering, and you made a very good point that, and this is why I love having you on right now, is I like having my beliefs challenged. I like feeling, I like being on shaky ground. Um, and I won't, I know I said only half hour. I'll keep you for 5 more minutes.
No, I'm loving this
Okay.
conversation.
Okay.
So
Awesome. Okay. Good. Awesome. Beautiful. Awesome. I'm so excited. You're right, by having this stuff all over the world, it makes it easier to use. It's like when we put forward the Patriot Act, well, when you got a big hammer, everything starts to look like a nail. And by having these everywhere, by having these supply lines, or as Mr. Arkin says, this sort of networked thing around the world, it makes it so easy to do anything. He brings up the General Soleimani example. He goes, it's important to note that any kind of iffiness about us killing him was around whether or not we wanted to. It wasn't that we couldn't. He was like, the AI picked him up. It picked him up on the phone, tracked him from the airport, Predator in the sky, Hellfire missile armed. We're ready to go. The entire if was, do we want to or not? It wasn't the system. By having these supply lines all over the world, by having these stashes of weapons of God knows what, not to mention nuclear weapons, aircraft carriers, all around the world, stashing, I think it's, where is it, Norway, that they have this huge, it's like a hollowed out mountain full of tanks that we have sitting there just in case the Soviet Union invades Norway. We have everything around. It makes it easier to just squash everything, and does it turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy?
Yeah, that's very much, these are my fears. And the bases in Norway, most of this infrastructure is a relic of World War II and the early days of the Cold War. And one of the problems in the Cold War is that a kind of mindset developed about US national security, that to maintain the security of the United States, you needed to maintain hundreds of bases and hundreds of thousands of troops around the world. And that just became dogma, and people stopped questioning it. And that was, much of the inspiration for Base Nation, was to question, why do we have 800 bases in over 80 countries around the world? What are these bases doing? Are they actually protecting us? Are they instead, serving to create a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy? I think the example of LeMay sending, the bombers to the borders of the Soviet Union and then pulling back at the last moment, that's what bases are. Except bases don't pull back; they are surrounding. And we're not talking about the early days of the Cold War now. We're talking about today.
Yeah.
The U.S. has literally hundreds of bases surrounding the borders of China and Russia and Iran and North Korea. And again, you did it very nicely. Try to imagine, for people in the United States, try to imagine how we would feel if there was even a single Chinese base or Russian base or Iranian base or North Korean base anywhere near the borders of the United States. People would freak out and call for an immediate military reaction, I have to think. So we should not be surprised when China and Russia in particular, when surrounded by US bases, Iran as well, North Korea as well, when they feel threatened by these US bases. And indeed, bases are meant to threaten. Sometimes they're portrayed as these are defensive in nature. No, bases are meant to threaten. But this is not an effective way to bring about peace or to secure the United States. And we can look to one prominent example from the Cold War. When Russia, the Soviet Union, built a single base
Beat me
near
to
the
it.
borders. of the United States, when they built a missile base in Cuba, this brought the world closer to nuclear Armageddon than we've ever been. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis when the Soviet Union built a single base. Meanwhile, again, during the Cold War and to this day, there are literally hundreds of bases surrounding the borders of then the Soviet Union, today Russia.
I'm so angry. You stole my thunder. It came into my mind. I was like, I had a perfect line. I was gonna say, what happened when they did one base? The whole world almost died, and you came in and you swooped it out from under me. But it's true. It happened once. It happened one time, and the entire world almost died. And that and is that even a bad thing? But then would we have to grant that to? And I got to be really careful about how I say this. Is the whole world dying a bad thing? We protected ourselves by saying you can't have them. Should that be an allowable mindset for, again, it's very easy for me to, grow up in the United States. I had a loving nuclear family. I got to go to private school. I've been incredibly blessed in every form imaginable. We have to put ourselves in the mind of a North Korean or Chinese, or Russian, an Iranian. If you're all around us, why aren't you gonna, for lack of a better term, throw some bows? This is my area. Back off. F off. This is my square. Don't come. I'm not hitting you. I'm not hitting you. I'm not. When my older brother would do that to me, well, you hit him back because you'd be like preemptively, I'm gonna hit you back. You can't do that. You can't come in here. Why did we take out Soleimani? It was a preemptive threat. We took him out in a foreign nation and called it a preemptive threat. And I had never thought about it till you said it. The B-47 Hustler streaking towards and then we pull away at the last minute and we say, didn't touch you. Here's another example. Okay, good. I can regain my thunder. Look at how we're freaking out and myself included. I am guilty of this more than anyone. Everyone knows on this podcast, I'm a raw American, but the artificial bases in the South China Sea or China's Belt and Road. I had on Brigadier General Robert Spalding, episode 161, who is in Obama's National Security Council. His book, Stealth War, is a big emphasis is China's Belt and Road Initiative. Why do we not like it? It's a $5 trillion plan for them to build infrastructure all over Africa and South America. And then when inevitably these nations can't pay them back, they say, hey, don't worry about it, but let us put a base there. We're losing our collective minds about this, that they haven't even done yet. They haven't even built the bases yet. We've had our own Belt and Road Initiative. As you say, as FDR, he should have asked Congress, but he just said it's done. What did Truman say? Anything that's, that we need for American national security. And then the chapter ends with, and any base that we deem we need, or any land we deem we need, we'll take. And it's like, it's a tough pill to swallow that the things we criticize most are just fractional reflections of what we've been doing for decades, or as your book points out, actually centuries.
Yeah, really, really well really, really well put. Better than I put just now. No, and it is important to point out that, of course, the first U.S. bases abroad were those built on Native American lands. They enabled the expansion and conquest of the United States across North America.
The crowbar.
But in recent times, I haven't seen evidence that suggests that there are any clauses or that there's reason to believe that China will impose military bases on countries that can't pay debts as part of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Sure. China
has a single base in Djibouti. It has 4 bases on human-made islands in the South China Sea that are disputed, and I think the international courts have ruled these are not, Chinese sovereign territory. And it has bases in occupied Tibet. But other than that, 0 bases abroad. Nothing compared to the United States' collection of 800 bases in over 80 countries and colonies. So I think for those who would say, someone needs to carry the big stick, someone needs to, this is inevitable. I think, first of all, we should question those narratives about human history and about humanity, because they are really actually constructions, just ideas, ideologies that have emerged largely in the Cold War period, in the 20th century. We need only look at China's model. China has created a massive economy and grown the size of its economy and improved the well-being of many of its people, with many suffering along the way. Don't get me wrong. But the model of maintaining military infrastructure around the world and troops and militarizing the globe is not the only way, and is, it seems to me, not a very effective way to protect the United States, to increase the size of our economy, and that and we need also ask, when was the last time China wasted money on a war? Last war China fought was in 1979. It was for a month. The United States, meanwhile, has been spending, again, $6.4 trillion just in the last 20 years alone on waging wars that have been disastrous. So, I think in addition to some of the other priorities I laid out, the absolute avoidance of any future wars, in addition to ending the current endless wars, have to be priorities for the Biden administration and any reasonable foreign policy that is actually focused on protecting people in the United States and protecting the security of the globe.
And there's another point is blowback, right? I mean, blowback's like making your bed and there's like a bubble of air and you just keep pushing the bubble around and you're like, why can't I get it? And then you finally do, and then the whole thing snaps up or something. But it's, when we're out, and a lot of this stuff classified, so we don't even know about it. But when we're doing these secret wars in Yemen or in Africa, and I'll try to pull it into my own experience. I lost one sibling 7 years ago to suicide. Terrible, self-inflicted, terrible. Grown from it. I've got my own whole journey story. Whatever. There's a billion lives. Everyone's got their own personal story. That was one death. This wasn't old age. This wasn't disease. This was a terrible death. That's one. Imagine if you were at a wedding, or maybe you were sick and you couldn't go to the wedding. And instead of seeing your cousin get married away, wish I was there. Sorry, I had work. Imagine if a Hellfire missile from, actually, well, let's use China. We'll call it a Dongfeng 14, I think. They're hypersonic missiles. What if a Dongfeng hypersonic missile vaporized your wedding? Your cousin, all those people you used to have Thanksgiving with, and all of our Western holidays, or you used to remember growing up. And I remember Christmas. I remember seeing Mimi and Beeps, my grandparents. Rest in peace. We go back and see them, and oh yeah, no, my mom always used to do this, and she'd cook, pecan, like hazelnut chocolate pie, and oh, my Aunt Sue was there. And imagine they're all gone. And imagine it's not 7 years later that me and my family were still holding each other up for. And God bless my family for that. Not one, but imagine all your cousins, all your uncles, all your aunts, and let's play devil's advocate. Maybe one of your uncles actually was a terrorist. Let's not even say it's completely innocent. Let's try to give a little to the other side. Okay, maybe I have one uncle X who is a bad guy, and damn, I didn't know that, and well, that's what you get. But imagine they're all gone now, and it's me, let's say, David, you're my older brother, it's just you and I. And we're not in the United States where, hey, at least I can put on a collared shirt, I can afford new paneling and a new MacBook, and I can at least stay occupied after my brother. I was able to move home to my parents who, provided for me and allowed me to go see a therapist, which again, mental health care, bring it back to the United States. We have this whole thing where I can build up and I can even at the very least stay occupied. I'm upwardly mobile. Hey, I'm having an interview with a cool guy. I listen to his audiobook. I love it. It's a great thing. Imagine you don't even have that. Imagine you're in a country that has no infrastructure, it has no running water. You're illiterate. You don't and you have zero sex education. All you know is a metal monster in the sky vaporized your family. You have nothing less. What else are you gonna do but try to go John Wick on the people that did it to you? And you don't really care if it's right. Now, when that happens every single day, well, the American people don't know that. So all we see are these terrorists, putting on their head garment and grabbing their AK-47. Yeah, they need to die. But the reality is is this us just making the bed and the bubbles are popping up on the corners, but you don't see that whole backstory of the family and the cousins and the wedding and Thanksgiving. All you see is there's another guy burning an American flag. Take him out. Sorry, I got a little riled up, but it's I mean, is it just going to go on forever that way?
I'm glad you got riled up. We all should be riled up, and we should be outraged. And in, those of us in the United States who are paying for this kind of destruction and this sort of misguided, blowback inducing policy, it will not go on that way if we refuse to let it go on that way. And I think we have to demand a change. It's the Hellfire missiles, like you said, or it's the missiles raining down from the sky on wedding parties, and it's bases. I mean, it's wars generally, but just the mere presence of bases. The research has shown that you put a base in people's country, first of all, anywhere, it's liable to generate opposition and protest almost everywhere U.S. bases have gone, but especially in the Middle East, especially in the presence of Muslim of bases in the Muslim Holy Lands. This was one of Bin Laden's justifications for the 9/11 attacks, the presence of U.S. bases and troops in Saudi Arabia. And other research has shown that in the Middle East generally, bases lead to increased recruitment by militant groups that would use terrorist acts as tools. But it doesn't have to be this way. The United States can and really must pursue a different path to engaging with the world and ensuring its security. I think we should all be, I think we can all be rah-rah, as you said, for the United States in a way that doesn't come at the expense of other people. Sure. And I think too many leaders, so-called leaders, have been supposedly rah-rah for the United States, or wrap themselves in the flag and nationalism, and continue to lead us down this path that ultimately will result in the destruction of this empire that we inhabit. And I think that is going to be the conclusion of this policy, of this long-term strategy of endless war and the bases that make those wars possible, unless we demand something different, unless leaders change course. And I think they can, and I think they must.
It's kind of have you ever read any of Smedley Butler? 1933 business plot. It's his whole thing. He's the most decorated, I think, Marine of all time. His whole war is a racket speech. But I mean, he had a great point, and he said that the military should be used for three things: defending our northern and southern border, defending our east and west coasts, and defending the Bill of Rights. And that was from the highest ranking guy, went in as an enlisted man, fought in World War I, rose all the way up to the point where he stump speeched for, he was a Republican, stump speeched for FDR. But so again, you kind of see this. It's one thing if you have a Timothy Leary or a Ram Dass dropping acid saying it, and the wars, man, like that's all great and good, but a lot of people can kind of brush that off as, oh, that's not real, But it's another thing when you have George Washington saying, don't get tied up in foreign affairs, when you have Ben Franklin saying a republic, if you can keep it, when you have Smedley Butler saying war is a racket, bring it all home, and then you have about 30 years later, who else but Dwight Eisenhower? I mean, the other top guy. I mean, are there higher people up than a Washington, a Smedley, an Eisenhower, and they all say the same thing. It's a racket. Their business interests. Come back home. This isn't me just, yelling in front of a camera. These are the most, respected, conditioned guys. And I don't know. I think to wrap this up, I know I've kept you 15 minutes over, 20 minutes over. I said I would. I'm terrible about that. As you can tell, I get very passionate. I think one of the chapters in your book, Everyone Serves, to me, that was the best microcosm of what this all is. And it's the idea that we have these military bases. What I forget the term you use. Is it Mayberry? Was that
that people think of them as sort of idyllic 1950s era suburbia?
Yeah. So he Mr. Vine explains all these bases as, you got your schools, you got your exchanges, you got all the women and children there. You can run around. You don't have to worry about crime. Everyone says, yes, ma'am, no, sir. And, in terms of wealth disparity, there's only a 10x difference between the lowest paid and the highest paid, which compared to Wall Street is 1 to 354 times. It's socially diverse, culturally diverse, strong support systems. I mean, really, it's the most ironic thing is the idea of this strong right wing military is it actually is one of the most like well executed forms of socialism, which is just hilariously ironic. But
Yes.
it's we have this whole thing where it's just really what it is, at least how I saw it in my mind, I visualized, is we have this very whitewashed, cleaned, hygienic outside the walls war goes on, but you don't really feel like it is through Skype, through all the amenities and the services and the bonuses and the healthcare and the schooling. It almost seems like it's as abstract as, my dad going to work for whoever when I was a kid, going to sell, chicken, go sell poultry, he'd wave goodbye, bye dad. But I mean, in this case, it's the soldier going out the door. And then even then, when someone dies, there's a 3-day blackout, there's the notification squad, the doctors come, the other wives provide support. But it's this very clean, concise. You don't see how sausages are made. You just take it out of the fridge and you microwave it, and there it is. But you don't see everything behind it. I think that chapter is a beautiful microcosm of what this whole system is. Because even now, this is the most in-depth conversation I've ever had about it. And what's the extent of this? It's in an air-conditioned room in a leather chair on a MacBook. I'm not seeing the screaming and the cry. And I have one guy on here all the time, Del Comstock, youngest member ever of Delta Force, worked for the CIA for several years. I mean, he is James Bond. He says the things that he thinks about the most over his whole career isn't PTSD from warfare and from killing others and seeing, his men be killed, but rather it's seeing, picking up a child, a crying child. And he's like, and realizing like this kid is the same weight as my son, or, seeing a woman and being like, that could be my wife. It's very sanitized and it's at a distance. And it's, I mean, what way around that is there? We don't feel it. I mean, the only other way you can say it is weather underground, and I mean that's going to get me flagged by the FBI. Bring the war home. Is there another way to do this other than directly feeling it, or is there going to have to be some? What is it going to have to be? Not that you know the answer, not to put that weight on your shoulder. What is it going to be? Are we going to have to pull them home and see that the world doesn't collapse, or baby steps, or what?
Well, I mean, there's so many important things you said just now. No, I so appreciate it,
Oh,
and so appreciate your effort on your own and your effort to encourage other people to put themselves in the shoes of others, to feel what it would feel like if we were on the receiving end of U.S. military policy, of
sure.
this policy of permanent infrastructures of bases encircling the globe, this basic policy of endless war. So I think that is an important part of the picture. I think also showing people in the United States that they have been harmed directly, that they're not only is their security been undermined, but their well-being, their lives have been harmed directly because we've been spending all this money on wars abroad, on bases abroad, and not investing in the lives and the healthcare and the mental health care of people here in the United States, and then getting people to demand change. I think that is the only possible way forward. But it is going to take a dramatic transformation of existing U.S. foreign policy, which is intertwined, of course, with U.S. domestic policy. But I think there are encouraging signs that such change is starting. That again, people across the political spectrum are realizing that the status quo is not sustainable, and that we have to transform and demand such transformation urgently.
Yeah. And I think we can do it. And I've said this before on this podcast. I look at other things like, as a more conservative guy like myself, but I always look at things like, the social systems in Nordic countries or Scandinavian countries, whatever the correct term is. I look at that, or as, as I do kind of break from the conservative mold when I do think there should be universal health care. Because as someone as myself, if I didn't have family to move into after my brother died, because I spiraled downwards, in all likelihood, I'd probably be dead. I probably would have taken my life 5 years ago. I mean, seriously, that's why I moved home. But I look at things like, why can't we look at a social system like we see in countries where it works? Why does it have to be this whole, oh no, that's Marxism? Why can't we look at it as a challenge? Why can't we look at it as Normandy or going to the moon or
Yeah.
Iwo Jima? Why can't we look at, I mean, we can make this rah rah America instead of, hey, we beat the Nazis, all right? We went toe to toe with the Soviets. We killed bin Laden. We can do all of that. Hey, why don't we take the next thing? I bet we can, bring healthcare home to all. I mean, we can make that rah rah America. Why not? Why can't that
And
be the cheer?
as you were saying, we don't even have to look at, Nordic countries or outside the United States. We can look at just the United States
United
military
States military.
and the system of schools and universal
Yeah.
health care and pretty generous benefits after you leave the military as a model.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to be just for members of the military.
Yeah. Why
This
can't it
can
be
be
everyone?
the model for the country as a whole. So I'm so glad that you are urging this kind of change, and that you feel the urgency and are communicating it to others and asking these questions that not enough people are asking.
Well, I tried to do that because I do lean more right, but I think of the Voltaire quote, and when I go against it, I feel stupid because his quote is the sign of an intelligent person is someone who can entertain an argument without necessarily believing it. And I find that by forcing myself out of my comfort zone and having discussions that break free of the mold, a lot of times I actually kind of open my mind to, I'm like, well, wait, hold on, that is a good argument. Why can't we do that? And as you just said just now, that I had never thought of, despite listening to your book 4 or 5 times, we don't even have to look to Nordic countries. We can literally look to our own U.S. military, the very thing that we push forward as our sign of might. I mean, again, the wealth disparity only 10x. The social and ideological diversification, the better than is better than average public schooling. Man, why can't we do that? Why can't we model it after that? And I don't know how that
Well,
happens.
I mean, the short answer is we
Yeah,
definitely can. And again, I think there are signs that we're moving in that direction. Biden just tonight is going to be proposing, I'm not sure when this is going to be available, then people will be listening after he's giving the speech, but he wants to expand childcare resources the way the US military provides childcare for its employees, for military personnel. He wants to expand the sort of the basic services that can provide for the well-being of people in the United States. It is important to point out that the US military, of course, has many problems beneath the surface of that
sure,
sort of glossy
sure.
suburbia. The epidemic of sexual assault
Mhm.
alone, the very high rates of drug abuse, alcohol abuse. There's a lot to be worked out,
Yeah.
but they have created an infrastructure of that supports the health and well-being of people, and we can do that on a national basis.
It's you do point out a great point, and then we'll wrap this up. I've kept you for twice the amount of time I said I would. Is right after World War II, how they showed it was that quote from like 1947, I think, and it was, we used to worry about ammo and tank barrels, and now we're worried about diapers, and it's kind of, these guys are just like, why are we bringing the women here? But what they later realized was, it went from the family members being called, well, it was basically a glorified term of like groupie. It turned from that to force amplification, because they realized what expensively trained and well-trained soldier. I mean, like anyone, you got to, it's like why your job would say you have to work here for 3 years if we're going to train you. Like, they got to get something out. The U.S. military realized that they were putting all this money into training these soldiers, and if their family was stuck at home, they would probably end up leaving the military to go get a better deal at home and be with their family. And what did they realize? Happy family, happy soldier, a well ready and armed and prepped force. Man, if that's not a microcosm of like, wait, maybe if everyone's cared for, just basic stuff, just you can get health care. You're not a cough away from bankruptcy. That might be a force amplification for the United States as a whole. It might bring everything up. And again, these are all just, I'm 30 years old with biology degree. I can't, say how the world should be run. But man, you pointed out, and that is how the military looked at it. They looked at it as, hey, bring the women and children. That wasn't like a bleeding heart thing from them. They looked at it as military tacticians do. Does this have a benefit on us? Well, it keeps the soldiers in the force. Then bring them over. Bring the wife and children over. Have the exchange services. We'll subsidize the gas. We'll fly their car over for free. Why did they do that? Because they found when the soldier was happier, the armed forces worked better. I mean, it's quite a conundrum, and it forces you to look at things. If we're going to so wildly support the military, well, then how does the military actually conduct itself? They conduct themselves a lot like a socialist organization. Hey, Mr. Vine, you're challenged my beliefs, and I
Well,
thank you.
Thank you, and please do call me David. I should have said that
David.
at
All right.
the very beginning.
Yeah.
And I would just say, if anyone is interested in learning more about U.S. bases abroad, and including movements to close bases abroad, a couple resources. One, my website, basenation.us, basenation.us. And then for an example of the kind of transpartisan, not just bipartisan, but transpartisan, really across the political spectrum, group that's organizing to call for closures abroad. There's the Overseas Base Realignment and Closure Coalition, the Overseas Base Realignment and Closure Coalition. And the website there is overseasbases.net, overseasbases.net. And yeah, I would just encourage people to get involved in changing this status quo that has been so disastrous for so many of us.
Absolutely. And for anybody listening, get the book on Audible. I'll put it in the description as always. I'll stick it in the top comment. It's an awesome. Again, everyone knows this. This is a one-man operation. There's no focus group saying I think you should have on David Vine. I have on whoever I want to have on. There are a lot of books I do listen to that I never reach out to the authors because it's an okay book, whatever. I love this book. It is in my top. Someone's going to call me out eventually. I'm going to have to actually solidify the top 10 to make sure there's not 40, but it is in my top 10. I do love it. It's a fantastically engaging book. And we didn't even touch on the half of it with human trafficking and military sexual trauma and, the war con building, defense con. I can't remember it goes further down the rabbit hole. We didn't even touch all of it in this episode, but I will put it in the description, stick it in the top comment. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. I'll put those websites, same thing, description, sticky top comment. David, I will email you when it's uploaded. It should be uploaded sometime this evening. And then your new book, I didn't know you had a third book. Your second book, United States of War, which I will have to get, and I will have to have you on for that. You don't have a say in the matter. What's your third book?
So yeah, no, I'd be happy to come back on. And in fact, the audio version is coming out just in I think within a month. Yes,
Okay.
a month from last Sunday. The paper, the hardback, is of course out for the United States of War. The third book is called Island of Shame: The Secret History of the U.S. Military Base on Diego Garcia, and it's about the one military base. A base in the middle of the Indian Ocean on this island, Diego Garcia, that only exists because the U.S. government, with the help of the British government, forcibly exiled an entire indigenous people from their homes on Diego Garcia and some surrounding islands, and deported them about 1,200 miles away. So it's the history of the base on Diego Garcia, how U.S. policymakers came to think it was a good idea to build a base there, that they needed to build a base there, and why they exiled an entire group of people in the process. And a lot of the book also focuses on the lives of the displaced Chagosians and what's become of them, including their struggle to return home, which is ongoing.
And you touched on a lot of that in Base Nation for everybody listening. Yeah, Henry Kissinger. It's only 90,000 people. Who gives a damn? And it's like, whew, that's and that was very last thing. I know I've signed off like 5 times now. Who was the president? And I think the 1800s that was it Monroe? No one shall colonize. There will be no European colonies in the Western Hemisphere, for it shall be our hemisphere. And by our moral superiority as a race, it already is our Man, when you hear that, you're just kind of like, Oh God.
So that's Teddy Roosevelt.
Okay.
It's the Roosevelt doctrine or
Oh,
corollary to the Monroe doctrine.
oh,
So they're directly connected, but yeah, shows how racism has underlined this whole story from the Chagosians to Latin America to the wars that have been fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yes,
it's it and with the mafia and I'm gonna end up keeping you for 9 hours, and I'm gonna keep signing off every 5 minutes. So I will let you go, David. I will email
thank
you. I
you.
would love to have you on for the United States of War and the Island of Shame. I will let you go. I kept you for twice as long as I said I would. Guys, go get the book. I can't fake my excitement. I don't plan any of my talks, so when I get jacked up and I start yelling, it's genuine. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, Tommy. You're the best. I look
Thank
forward
you,
to
man.
talking again.
Oh, absolutely. All right, man. God bless. Thank you for being on here. Stay safe, everybody.